I was 23 years old when I walked out of Riverside Reformatory with nothing but the clothes on my back and $17 in my pocket. The guard who processed my release barely looked at me as he handed over a plastic bag containing my old wallet, a broken watch, and a bus token that had probably expired 2 years ago. "Good luck out there, Martinez," he said, and I knew he didn't mean it. Nobody ever means it when they say that to someone like me. The August sun hit my face like a slap, and for a moment I just stood there on the concrete steps, squinting at a world that had kept spinning without me for 3 years. 3 years. That's how long I'd been locked up for a crime I didn't commit, but nobody cared about that detail. The justice system doesn't apologize, it just opens the door and expects you to figure out the rest on your own. I had no family waiting for me, no friends who hadn't moved on, no job prospects, and nowhere to go. My mother had passed away 6 months into my sentence, and I hadn't even been allowed to attend her funeral. That thought still burned in my chest like acid every single day. I walked down 4th Street with no destination in mind, just putting one foot in front of the other because that's what you do when standing still feels like drowning. The city looked different somehow. Sharper and faster, like everyone had upgraded to a new version of life while I was stuck running on old software. People rushed past me with their phones and their purpose, and I felt like a ghost haunting my own existence. I spent that first night under a bridge near the downtown area, using my jacket as a pillow and listening to the sound of traffic overhead. Sleep came in broken pieces, the way it always did now, interrupted by the phantom sounds of cell doors clanging and voices echoing down corridors that no longer held me but somehow never let me go. The next few weeks blurred together into a grey smear of survival. I did odd jobs when I could find them, cash under the table work that didn't require background checks or explanations. I hauled trash for a restaurant that paid me $40 to clean out their dumpster area. I held signs for a guy advertising his going out of business furniture sale, standing on a corner for 8 hours in the blazing sun for $60. I slept in shelters when there was space, which wasn't often, and on park benches when there wasn't. I learned which fast food places would let you fill a water cup without buying anything, which convenience stores had bathrooms that didn't require a key, and which parts of the city the police patrolled most heavily at night. One morning, I woke up on a bench near Patterson Park and found a business card tucked into the pocket of my jacket. It was fancy, cream-colored with raised lettering that read Henderson and Associates, Estate Law, with an address in the financial district and a phone number below it. On the back, someone had written in blue ink, "Regarding the estate of Margaret Elena Martinez, please contact immediately." My hands started shaking as I read it over and over, because Margaret Elena Martinez was my mother's name, and I couldn't understand how or why an estate lawyer would be leaving me cryptic notes while I slept on park benches. I walked to the public library and asked to use their phone, my heart hammering so hard I could barely hear my own voice. The receptionist who answered was polite but professional, and when I gave my name and said I was calling about Margaret Martinez's estate, there was a long pause before she said, "Mr. Martinez, we've been trying to locate you for 7 months. Can you please come to our office today? Mr. Henderson has been very eager to speak with you." I almost laughed at that because eager wasn't a word anyone had used in connection with me in years, but I said yes and wrote down the address on the back of a receipt I found in my pocket. The building was all glass and steel, the kind of place where the doorman looks at you like he's calculating your net worth before deciding whether to open the door. I walked in anyway, dirty jeans and all, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The law office was exactly what you'd expect. Mahogany furniture and leather chairs, and a view of the city that probably cost more per month than I'd earned in the last 3 years combined. The secretary looked surprised when I gave my name, like she couldn't quite reconcile the person on the phone with the person standing in front of her, but she recovered quickly and led me to a conference room where a man in his 50s with grey hair and kind eyes was waiting. "Mr. Martinez," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "I'm Robert Henderson. Thank you for coming in. Please sit down." I shook his hand and sat, feeling completely out of place in this room that smelled like expensive coffee and leather. He opened a folder in front of him and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I'm going to be direct with you, because I think you deserve that. Your mother passed away 8 months ago, and she left behind a considerable estate that you are the sole beneficiary of. I've been trying to locate you since then, but you seem to have vanished after your release from Riverside. I finally hired a private investigator who tracked you down last week." My brain couldn't process what he was saying. Estate, beneficiary. My mother had worked as a housekeeper her entire life, cleaning office buildings at night and sleeping during the day. We'd lived in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like bleach and instant coffee, and there had never been money for anything beyond the basics. "I don't understand," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "My mother didn't have an estate. She barely had enough to cover rent most months." Henderson nodded like he'd expected this reaction, and he pulled out several documents from the folder, spreading them across the table between us. "Your mother inherited a property from her uncle, your great-uncle Thomas Wellington, about 15 years ago. She never told you about it because the property was in a remote area of Montana, nearly 3 hours from the nearest major city, and she believed it was worthless. The land had been in the Wellington family for generations, but it had fallen into disrepair, and your mother never had the resources to do anything with it." He slid a photograph across the table, and I found myself looking at an old farmhouse surrounded by mountains, the kind of landscape you see in paintings but never expect to encounter in real life. The house looked rough, with peeling paint and sagging shutters, but the land around it stretched out in rolling hills, covered in grass and wildflowers. "This is the property," Henderson continued. 240 acres in Valley County, Montana. Your mother paid the property taxes on it every year. Barely, but she held on to it because it was the only thing her family had ever owned. When she passed away, I was contacted because she had listed me as the executor of her will, something she'd set up years ago through a free legal clinic. I stared at the photograph, trying to match this image with the mother I'd known, the woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion just to keep us fed and housed. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" I asked, and Henderson's expression softened. "I asked her that once, about 5 years ago, when she came in to update her will. She said she didn't want you to feel obligated to a piece of land that was more burden than blessing. She said she wanted you to build your own life, not inherit her struggles." The words hit me like a punch to the chest, because that sounded exactly like something my mother would say, always protecting me, even when there was nothing left to protect me from. "Here's where things get interesting," Henderson said, leaning forward. "About 4 months ago, a development company called Northern Vista Properties contacted my office. They'd been surveying the area around your property for a potential resort development, something about luxury ecotourism and mountain retreats. In the process, they discovered that your land sits on top of a significant aquifer, one of the largest underground water sources in that region. They also found that the southern section of your property contains mineral deposits, nothing explosive but enough to be valuable. They made an offer to purchase the property." He slid another document across the table, and I looked down at a number that made my vision blur. $2,300,000. I couldn't breathe. The number sat there on the page like a foreign language, something my brain recognized but couldn't translate into meaning. "That can't be right," I said, looking up at Henderson. "That's a mistake." He shook his head, a small smile on his face. "It's not a mistake, Mr. Martinez. I've verified the offer through multiple channels, and I've had 3 independent appraisers evaluate the property. If anything, Northern Vista is getting a bargain because they're banking on you not knowing the true value. With the water rights alone, you could probably negotiate for closer to $3 million, maybe more if you play it right." The room felt like it was tilting, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "I've been sleeping on park benches," I said, and my voice cracked. I've been digging through trash and begging for work, and you're telling me I own property worth millions." Henderson's expression turned somber, and he reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but close enough that I could feel the gesture. "I'm sorry it took so long to find you. If I'd known you were released, I would have contacted you immediately. Your mother's will was clear. Everything goes to you, including the property and a small savings account she maintained, about $8,000. I've already set that up for immediate transfer to you." I sat there, trying to process information that felt completely disconnected from reality. $8,000, which would have changed my life a month ago, now seemed almost trivial next to the other number, $2,300,000. I could say it in my head, but I couldn't make it feel real. "What do I need to do?" I asked finally, because that was the only question I could formulate. Henderson pulled out more papers, his lawyer mode fully engaged now. "First, we need to establish your identity legally, which shouldn't be difficult given your recent release documentation. Then we need to transfer the property title into your name, which is mostly paperwork. After that, you have options. You can sell to Northern Vista, you can negotiate with other buyers, or you can keep the property and develop it yourself." "I don't know anything about farming or land development," I said, stating the obvious. Henderson nodded. "You don't have to. That's what advisors and property managers are for, but I'd suggest you at least visit the property before making any decisions. See what your mother held on to all those years. Understand what you're selling if you decide to sell." Something about the way he said it made me pause, like there was more to this story than just dollar amounts and legal documents. "Have you seen it?" I asked. "The property, I mean." He nodded slowly. "I drove out there about 2 months ago, just to get a sense of what we were dealing with. It's beautiful, Mr. Martinez, isolated and rough around the edges, but beautiful, the kind of place that makes you understand why people used to cross continents looking for land to call their own. Hey, if you've made it this far in the story, I'd really love it if you hit that subscribe button and become part of this community. We share stories about second chances, unexpected turns, and the kind of real-life plot twists that remind us anything is possible. Drop a comment below and tell me, if you suddenly discovered you owned property you never knew about, would you sell it immediately or would you want to see it first? I'm genuinely curious what you'd do in my situation, so let's talk about it. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about hope and unexpected blessings, share this video with them. Now let me tell you what happened next. Henderson arranged everything with an efficiency that made my head spin. Within 48 hours, I had a temporary ID, a bank account with $8,000 in it, and a bus ticket to Montana. He also gave me the keys to the farmhouse, a thick folder of documents about the property, and his personal cell phone number. "Call me if you need anything," he said as I left his office. "And Martinez, take your time with this decision. Money is important, but some things matter more than money. Your mother understood that, even if she never had much of either." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and walked out into a world that suddenly looked completely different than it had just 2 days ago. The bus ride to Montana took 18 hours, and I spent most of it staring out the window watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to endless farmland to mountains that seemed to touch the sky. I'd never been this far from the city, never really traveled anywhere except in the back of police cars and prison transport vehicles. The other passengers kept to themselves, which suited me fine because I didn't know how to explain what I was doing or where I was going. How do you tell a stranger that you're traveling to claim an inheritance you never knew existed, to see a property your mother held secret for reasons you're still trying to understand? The bus dropped me off in a town called Whitefish, population 7,000 according to the sign, and from there I had to hire a local guy named Dale to drive me the rest of the way. Dale was in his 60s with weathered skin and a truck that had seen better decades, but he knew every back road in the county. "You're going to the old Wellington place?" he asked when I gave him the address. "Haven't seen anybody out there in years. Heard old Margaret died. Sorry about that. She was a good woman, used to send money for the property taxes like clockwork." I nodded, not ready to explain that Margaret was my mother and I was her son, who'd been too locked up to even know she'd passed. The drive took another hour and a half, winding through valleys and along ridgelines that made my stomach drop. The pavement gave way to gravel, and then the gravel gave way to dirt, and finally Dale pulled up in front of a gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. "This is as far as the truck goes," he said. "Road gets too rough from here. You'll have to walk the last quarter mile." He helped me with my bag, which wasn't much since I didn't own much, and pointed toward a path that disappeared into the trees. "Follow that, and you'll hit the farmhouse. You need me to wait." I shook my head. "I'll figure it out from here." He looked at me like he wanted to say something else, but he just nodded and handed me his card. "Call if you get stuck. Phone service is spotty, but you might catch a signal on the hill behind the house." I walked through the gate and followed the path through pine trees that smelled like Christmas and childhood memories I didn't know I had. The silence was absolute, no traffic sounds or human voices or sirens in the distance, just wind through branches and birds calling to each other and my own footsteps on dirt. After about 15 minutes, the trees opened up and I saw it, the farmhouse from the photograph, sitting in the middle of a valley, surrounded by mountains that looked like paintings someone had arranged just for this view. The house was worse than the picture suggested, with holes in the roof and windows that were either broken or missing entirely, but the bones of it were still there, still standing after who knows how many winters and storms. I walked up to the porch slowly, half expecting the whole structure to collapse under my weight, but the wood held firm, even if it creaked with every step. The front door was locked, and I used the key Henderson had given me, a large old-fashioned thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. The lock turned with resistance, and the door swung open on hinges that screamed for oil. Inside, the house was dark and dusty, with furniture covered in sheets and floors covered in years of neglect. But underneath all that decay, I could see what it had been, a real home with a stone fireplace and hardwood floors and windows that framed the mountains like living art. I spent the next hour just walking through the rooms, trying to imagine my mother's uncle living here, trying to understand why my mother had kept this secret for so long. In what must have been the master bedroom, I found an old trunk pushed against the wall. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing the farm in better days. There were pictures of people I didn't recognize, presumably the Wellington family, standing in front of the house when it was freshly painted and proud. There were pictures of fields being worked, of horses and cattle, of seasons changing across the land. And tucked in the very bottom, wrapped in a cloth, I found a letter addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, and I had to sit down on the dusty floor because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. "My dear Marcus," it began, and I could hear her voice in the words. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Mr. Henderson found you and brought you here. I'm sorry I never told you about this place while I was alive. I was afraid that you'd feel obligated to save something that maybe didn't deserve saving. Afraid that you'd sacrifice your dreams for a piece of land that brought my family more heartbreak than happiness. But I kept it anyway, paid those taxes every year even when I could barely afford it, because sometimes hope is the only inheritance worth leaving behind." The letter continued, and I read through tears I didn't bother wiping away. She wrote about her Uncle Thomas, who'd bought this land in 1962, with dreams of building something lasting, who'd worked himself into an early grave, trying to make a farm succeed in conditions that fought him every season. She wrote about visiting here as a child, about the beauty of the mountains and the harshness of the winters, and the way the land could make you feel both impossibly small and importantly significant at the same time. She wrote about holding on to it even after Thomas died, even after everyone said she should sell, because she believed that someday something good would come from it, something that would justify all the struggle and sacrifice. "I don't know what this property will be worth when you find it," she wrote near the end. "Maybe nothing, maybe something, but I hope you'll at least see it before you decide what to do with it." I hope you'll stand on that front porch and look at those mountains and understand why some things are worth holding on to, even when they don't make sense on paper. Whatever you decide, know that I'm proud of you. Know that I never stopped believing in you, even when the world did. Know that you deserved better than what life gave you, but you have the strength to build something new from whatever pieces you're left with. Love always, Mom. I sat on that floor for a long time, holding that letter and crying in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the day they locked me up. I cried for my mother, who'd worked so hard and died alone while I was trapped behind walls. I cried for the 3 years they'd stolen from me, for the goodbye I never got to say, for all the conversations we'd never have. And I cried because sitting in this broken-down farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me. Hope isn't something you buy or inherit or earn. It's something you choose to hold on to, even when every logical reason says you should let it go. I spent that first night in the farmhouse with no electricity, no running water, and a sleeping bag I'd bought at a truck stop on the way there. I cleared out one of the bedrooms upstairs, swept away the worst of the dust and debris, and lay there listening to sounds I'd never heard before. The absolute quiet of a place where humans hadn't disturbed the peace in years. Every creak of the house settling made me tense at first, conditioned responses from years of sleeping in places where every sound could mean danger, but gradually I started to relax into it. These weren't threatening sounds. They were just the language of an old house remembering how to breathe. When morning came, I walked the property with Henderson's survey maps in my hand, trying to match the lines on paper with the reality stretching out in front of me. The 240 acres seemed impossible to grasp, more land than I'd ever imagined one person could own. There were sections of dense forest, meadows filled with wildflowers I couldn't name, a stream that ran clear and cold along the western boundary, and everywhere those mountains standing like sentinels watching over everything. I found the remnants of old fences, pieces of farm equipment rusting into the earth, a barn that had partially collapsed but still held the ghost of what it had been. On the southern section, where Northern Vista's surveyors had found the mineral deposits, I discovered an old mine entrance, boarded up and marked with warnings that had faded to illegibility. This must have been what Thomas Wellington had hoped would make his fortune, some vein of copper or silver that had promised wealth, but delivered just enough to keep the dream alive without ever fulfilling it. I sat on a rock near the mine entrance and pulled out the offer letter from Northern Vista, reading through it again with different eyes. $2,300,000 for land that my family had bled into for generations, for water rights and minerals and the kind of pristine wilderness that developers saw as raw material for profit. I thought about what that money could do. I could buy a house, a real house in a real city with neighbors and grocery stores and all the conveniences of modern life. I could go back to school, finish the degree I'd started before everything went wrong. I could invest it, live off the returns, never have to worry about sleeping on park benches or digging through trash or holding signs in the blazing sun ever again. It was more money than my mother had seen in her entire life, more than I'd ever dreamed of having. It was security and possibility, and a future that didn't involve constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next disaster would strike. But sitting there on that rock with the mountains around me and my mother's letter folded in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that selling would be betraying something important, something that didn't have a clear name but felt as solid as the ground beneath me. My mother had held onto this place through poverty and hardship and every logical reason to let it go. She'd paid those taxes year after year, sacrificing things she needed so she could keep something she might never use. And she'd done it because she believed that someday, somehow it would matter, that someday someone, maybe me, would need exactly what this land had to offer. I spent the next 3 days exploring and thinking and trying to imagine different versions of my future. I hiked to the highest point on the property, a ridge that gave me a view of the entire valley, and I watched the sun set over mountains that had seen generations come and go. I fixed small things in the house, replacing broken boards and clearing out debris, not because I'd decided to stay, but because the work felt good, purposeful in a way that nothing had felt in years. I caught fish from the stream and cooked them over a fire I built in the stone fireplace, and I slept better than I had since before Riverside, maybe better than I'd ever slept in my life. On the fourth day, I hiked into town and found a coffee shop with Wi-Fi, and I started researching. I looked up sustainable farming, off-grid living, conservation easements, and agricultural grants. I read about people who'd taken abandoned land and brought it back to life, who'd built businesses around organic farming, or ecotourism, or education. I learned about water rights, and how valuable they were becoming as climate change made fresh water increasingly scarce. I discovered that Montana had programs to help new farmers, especially those working with sustainable practices, and that there were organizations that would pay to keep land wild rather than developed. The more I read, the more a crazy idea started forming in my mind. What if I didn't sell? What if I took some of the money from my mother's savings, just enough to get started, and tried to make this place work? Not as a traditional farm, because I didn't know the first thing about farming, and the land had been fallow too long for that anyway, but maybe as something else. Something that honored what my mother and her uncle had tried to build, while acknowledging that the world had changed. Maybe as a conservation project, or a wilderness retreat, or simply as a place that stayed wild and free while everything around it got bought up and developed into something unrecognizable. I called Henderson from that coffee shop, and he answered on the second ring. "How's Montana treating you?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "It's beautiful," I said. "It's also completely impractical and probably impossible to maintain, and I have no idea what I'm doing." He laughed. "So you're thinking about keeping it?" It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about it," I admitted. "Which is crazy, right? I could take the money, set myself up for life, never have to worry about anything again. That's the smart play." Henderson was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, can I tell you something your mother said to me once? She said that smart plays are overrated, that the world has plenty of smart people doing smart things, and most of them end up just as lost as everyone else. She said sometimes you have to do something that doesn't make sense on paper because your heart knows something your head hasn't figured out yet." "She really said that?" I asked. "Word for word," Henderson replied. "It was right after I'd advised her to sell this property for the 5th time. She looked at me with that expression she had, the one that said she'd heard my logic and appreciated it and was going to completely ignore it, and she gave me that little speech. I never brought up selling again after that." I laughed, recognizing my mother perfectly in that description. "So, what do you think I should do?" I asked, knowing it was unfair to put that on him, but needing to hear someone else's perspective. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should figure out what you're trying to build, and then decide if this land can help you build it. Money is a tool, Marcus. So is land. The question isn't which tool is more valuable, it's which tool you need for the life you want to create." I thanked him and ended the call. And I sat in that coffee shop for another 2 hours, making lists and crossing things out, and trying to calculate costs and possibilities. The numbers were daunting. Even basic repairs on the house would cost tens of thousands. Getting proper infrastructure, electricity and water systems and internet would cost tens of thousands more. And that was before considering anything ambitious, like starting a business or developing the land in any meaningful way. The $8,000 my mother left me wouldn't go far, and I'd need to find income fast, or I'd burn through it in months. But there was another option, one that made my stomach clench with anxiety, but also with something that felt like excitement. I could sell part of the land, not to Northern Vista, but to a conservation group I'd read about that bought up wilderness to keep it protected. They'd pay fair market value for maybe 50 or 60 acres, enough to give me a financial cushion while letting me keep the heart of the property. It wouldn't be the windfall that selling everything would bring, but it would be enough to start building something, enough to give my mother's dream a real chance instead of just abandoning it for the easier path. I drove back to the property with my mind made up, or at least made up enough to take the next step. I wasn't ready to commit to forever, but I was ready to commit to trying, to giving this place and myself a real chance before deciding that money was more important than meaning. I called the conservation group from the hilltop where Dale said I might catch a signal, and I was right. A woman named Sarah answered, and when I explained what I had and what I was thinking, her enthusiasm was immediate and genuine. "We've been watching that area for years," she said. "Northern Vista has been buying up everything they can, and we've been trying to create a buffer of protected land. If you're serious about selling a portion for conservation, we'd absolutely be interested in discussing terms." We set up a meeting for the following week, and in the meantime I threw myself into work on the property. I hired a local contractor, a guy named Pete who Dale recommended, and we started making a list of what needed to be done to make the house livable. "You're looking at probably $70,000 to get this place up to code," Pete said, after walking through with me. "That's assuming we find no major structural issues, which we probably will once we start opening up walls." The number should have scared me, but somehow it didn't. It felt manageable, real, like a problem that had solutions instead of an impossible obstacle. The meeting with the conservation group went better than I'd hoped. Sarah came out with 2 colleagues, and they walked the property with genuine reverence, pointing out wildlife signs and rare plants, and talking about ecological corridors and habitat preservation. "We'd like to purchase 80 acres along your western boundary," Sarah said finally, "the section that includes the stream and the old-growth forest. We can offer you $450,000, and we'd structure it so you retain trail access and water rights for your remaining property." It was less than Northern Vista was offering for everything, but it was enough, more than enough, to fix the house and build something sustainable and give myself time to figure out what came next. I accepted their offer, and suddenly I was navigating a world of lawyers and contracts and environmental surveys, Henderson guiding me through it all with patient expertise. The sale took 6 weeks to finalize, and during that time I lived on the property and worked on it every day, learning its rhythms and moods and possibilities. I met my neighbors, scattered as they were across miles of countryside, and found a community of people who'd chosen this hard, beautiful life over easier options. They taught me about well maintenance and wood stove operation, and which roads became impassable in winter. They shared tools and advice and occasionally meals, and slowly I started to feel like I belonged somewhere for the first time in years. When the money from the conservation sale came through, I paid Pete to start the renovations, and I bought a used truck from Dale's nephew, and I set up a proper camp on the property with a generator and a water filtration system. I also started planning what came next, the bigger vision beyond just survival. I researched wilderness therapy programs and educational retreats, places that brought troubled kids or veterans or anyone who needed healing out to nature for intensive programs. I thought about my own time in Riverside, about how the worst part wasn't the physical confinement, but the complete disconnection from anything real or growing or alive. What if this land could be a place for people like me, people who'd been locked away from the world and needed to remember how to be part of it again? I reached out to organizations that worked with formerly incarcerated people, and I pitched them an idea that was still half-formed but felt right in my gut. A program that brought people here for 3-month residencies, teaching them sustainable living skills while giving them space to heal and plan and figure out their next steps. Room and board, in exchange for work on the land, no judgment about their past, just an opportunity to build something new in a place that understood about second chances. The responses were cautious but interested, and several organizations said they'd be willing to partner if I could get the program off the ground. By the time winter started creeping into the valley, the house had a new roof and functioning plumbing and electricity that ran on solar panels Pete had helped me install. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and warm, and mine in a way nothing had ever been mine before. I'd also cleared out the barn and started repairs there, envisioning it as a workshop and gathering space for the program I was building. I spent my evenings reading by the fire and my days working with my hands, and somewhere in those months I realized I was happy, genuinely happy, in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Henderson came to visit in early December, making the long drive from the city to see what I'd built. He walked through the house and the property, nodding approvingly at the improvements and asking detailed questions about my plans. "Your mother would be proud," he said as we stood on the porch watching snow dust the mountain peaks. "Not because of the money or the property or any of that, but because you chose to build instead of just cashing out and disappearing." I thought about that, about my mother and her stubborn hope and her belief that some things were worth holding on to, even when they didn't make sense. "I'm naming the program after her," I said. "The Margaret Martinez Second Chance Farm. Once I get it running, I mean." Henderson smiled and pulled an envelope from his jacket. "She'd like that. And speaking of which, I have something else for you. I found this in her belongings, a letter she wrote but never sent. It's addressed to you, dated about 2 months before she died." My hands trembled as I took it, recognizing her handwriting on the envelope. I opened it carefully and read words she'd written when she knew she was dying but couldn't reach me. Words about love and forgiveness and the future she hoped I'd find. "You're going to make mistakes," she wrote near the end. "You're going to have days when you wonder if you made the right choice, and nights when you miss the simplicity of just taking the money and running. But I hope you'll remember that the best things in life are rarely the easy things, and that building something that matters is always harder and more worthwhile than just collecting payment for something someone else built." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket next to the first one, 2 pieces of paper that had become my compass and my courage. Henderson left the next morning, and I stood on that porch alone, looking out at the valley covered in fresh snow and the mountains beyond, and the barn where I'd start bringing people in the spring. I thought about the life I'd almost lived, the one where I sold everything and disappeared into comfortable anonymity, and I felt grateful that I'd chosen differently. Not because this path was easier, it definitely wasn't, but because it was mine, built from the pieces of my mother's hope and my own need to prove that second chances weren't just words people said to make themselves feel better about abandoning people like me. The first resident arrived in April, a guy named James, who'd done 6 years for drug charges and came out to find that the world had no place for him. I picked him up at the bus station in Whitefish, the same one where Dale had picked me up months earlier, and I drove him back along roads I now knew by heart. "What's the catch?" he asked as we turned onto the property. "There's always a catch." I smiled, remembering asking Henderson almost the same question. "No catch," I said. "Just work and honesty and a willingness to believe that your past doesn't have to define your future. Think you can handle that?" He looked at me, then at the mountains, then back at me. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think maybe I can." By summer, I had 4 residents, and by fall, the program had a waiting list. We worked the land together, building trails and planting gardens and repairing fences that would keep the property defined but not closed off. We had morning meetings where people shared their stories and evening sessions where we learned practical skills from local experts who volunteered their time. And slowly, one person at a time, I watched people transform from the broken versions of themselves that the system had created into something stronger and more hopeful. Not perfect, none of us were perfect, but real and trying and building lives that mattered. 2 years after I walked out of Riverside with nothing, I stood on that same porch where I'd first read my mother's letter and looked out at a valley that was alive with purpose. The Margaret Martinez Second Chance Farm wasn't just a place anymore. It was a community, a movement, a living testament to the idea that inheritance isn't just about what you receive, but what you choose to do with it. And every time someone arrived broken and left whole, every time someone learned to believe in themselves again, I felt my mother's presence in the wind, through the pines, and the mountains standing witness. And I knew exactly why she'd held on to this impossible piece of land through all those impossible years. She'd been holding it for me, waiting for the moment when I'd need it most, trusting that when that moment came, I'd have the courage to choose hope over comfort and building over cashing out. And standing there with the sunset painting, the mountains gold, and the sound of laughter drifting from the barn, where my residents were preparing dinner, I understood that the real inheritance wasn't the land or the money or any of the tangible things. It was the belief, passed down from my mother through years of struggle and sacrifice, that every person deserves a second chance, and every broken thing has the potential to become beautiful again if someone is willing to do the work of rebuilding. If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here. This community is built on people like you who believe in second chances and the power of stories to remind us what's possible. If this touched you in any way, please hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories about transformation, hope, and the unexpected ways life can surprise us. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been given a second chance that changed everything? Or maybe you've been the person who gave someone else that chance. Share your story with us, because this community is built on our collective experiences and wisdom. And here's my question for you. What did this story teach you about inheritance, about family, about choosing the hard right thing over the easy wrong thing? Drop your thoughts below. Let's have a real conversation about it. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, someone who's struggling to believe that their past doesn't define their future, share this video with them. Sometimes the right story at the right time can change everything. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.